Hello and welcome again to the Writer Review. This is Eric Rudd Writer, and this week we're going to be taking a look back at the 2017 political drama historical piece called The Darkest Hour. Now, Darkest Hour runs for 2 hours and 5 minutes long. It is directed by Joe Wright. It is produced by Tim Bevan, Lisa Bruce, Eric Fellner, Anthony McCartan, and Douglas Urbanski. The script was written by Anthony McCartan. The score was done by Dario Marinelli. The cinematography by Bruno Dalbonel, and it was edited by Valerio Bonelli. And the stars of the movie are Gary Oldman. We also have Kristin Scott Thomas, Lily James, Stephen Dillane, Ronald Pickup, Samuel West, Ben Mendelsohn, Richard Lumsden, Malcolm Storry, Nicolas Jones, David Schofield, Hilton McRae, Benjamin Withrow. In one of his last performances, he sadly passed away. And I think this ammovie actually was released posthumously with him in there. We also had Joe Armstrong, Adrian Rawlins, David Bamber, and Paul Leonard. So here's what has to be said about this movie. All right, so director Joe Wright takes The Darkest Hour to the early days of when Winston Churchill first became Prime Minister of England, of Great Britain. This was during, of course, the time when World War II was kicking off, and this was, I guess, during the time when Winston Churchill got his invitation to the deadly bloody party, so to speak. Yeah, this is definitely early days of Churchill's run as Prime Minister of Great Britain. He's now on his own in his involvement during one of the darkest moments in world history, as World War II was at its pinnacle. Churchill is now up to the task to make the most harshest, most difficult decisions that will definitely determine the fate of Europe if such parties should succeed. And if he should succeed, then England and the entire Europe would be pretty much saved from Hitler's tyranny. But if he should fail, then who knows what would happen. One thing for sure, failure is not an option. So while the performers might have a well balance of character, both physically and mentally, the real red herring was when the script meanders into the realms of fantasy over accuracy. I think, in my personal opinion, Darkest Hour, I think one of the things that I kind of feared the most about Darkest Hour was I hated it. I hated the whole notion. I was actually kind of worried here that this movie was going to eventually fall victim to self-parody. I mean, many historical figures have been lampooned, spoofed, parodied, and I felt that this one was going to fall into that category. It almost did, but by virtue, it didn't. Thank goodness for that. Because I would have given this a lower grade if it did fall into that category. I mean, World War II was a very serious moment in history, and I would just feel that it would be just tasteless and shameless if they would have spoofed a deadly, devastating time in world history. This was not a pleasant moment in life, and people endured quite a lot. And there are just certain things in life that can't be laughed at. This is one of them. So thank God that this movie did not go into that category of self-parody. In recent years, Sir Winston Churchill has been a popular fictional character to portray, with, President Lincoln coming up close second. Hell, in 2012, we had a few actors who are playing the part of Abraham Lincoln. But Winston Churchill has often been a interesting choice of a political figure who has been portrayed. From Brian Cox to John Lithgow, from Michael Gambon to Robert Hardy, and getting mentioned in high prolific movies like Dunkirk, A United Kingdom, and Viceroy's House. I think it was a safe bet to say that it's now time for Gary Oldman to step up to the front of the line to portray probably one of the greatest prime ministers in British history. Oldman just practically molded himself into the role of Sir Winston Churchill. He just practically nailed the scene, as, from his strengths to his weaknesses. You could tell that the guy had his share of weaknesses. He was a drunk. He was borderline misogynistic. He was practically almost like an unreliable guy to actually want to be confident enough to lead a country. Many people didn't really have that much faith in him. But still, Oldman managed to mold himself in near-perfect detail, from the rounded jowls to the rich, sonorous voice. Oldman's portrayal is definitely one of the best of the whole bunch. And I think he did a very, very solid job of playing Churchill in all his strengths and all his weaknesses. They made him into a flawed character, but not too much as to make him as to take his role lightly. But yes, when you think about it, all historical political characters have quirks, have strengths, have weaknesses. And we actually examine it without prejudice. Wright's film directs us to the month of May of 1940, where ailing Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, played by Ronald Pickup, declares that he's resigning his position due to him not really being up to the task to stand up to the regiments that's taking place at the time being, that he's just not really the person to do this job. Also, citing health issues as well. So with poor health and with poor confidence, Prime Minister Chamberlain eventually signs his resignation from his position, but still continues to sort of hang around, and so he does. Of course, he's not alone in his process to resignation. In Britain, the other important party, aside from the Conservatives, is the Labour Party, which has always been a big rivalry in Great Britain. And it's been discovered that Labour Party leader Clement Attlee, played by David Schofield, is also in on having Prime Minister Chamberlain out of office. At first, Chamberlain eventually agrees to have his resignation intact, as he appoints Viscount Halifax, played by Stephen Dillane, to take over his position, but felt he wasn't really up to the task himself. Therefore, Chamberlain digs deep, and he appoints Chamberlain to replace him. In an awkward twist, we find that during his inauguration, Chamberlain was nowhere to be found, with one MP whispering something made for some witty, sarcastic banter. The dialogue used in Anthony McCartan's script provides the weak spots to Darkest Hour. I mean, this is supposed to be a pretty intense drama, but I think that they seem to tend to make it very lightly, and they use way too many comedic one-liners in this movie, which sets the movie really far back. The dialogue used here was replaced with a reverent use of speech to more cynical humor that almost feels satirical over authentic. And sometimes I think that this cynical humor, this satirical humor, seems to also come across as being a bit forced, which should not have been the case at all. Sure, not everybody was going to approve Churchill taking over as the leader. It's quite obvious, and that's understanding. But the cynical humor and the satirical elements that's run amok in this movie is really, really quite distracting. I don't think they would, the things that was said in this movie, I don't think they would have said in real life. And I don't think they even took it into a dramatic context. If he was a no-show, people would be more concerned about his whereabouts and sometimes even question if whether or not he is up to the task of running a leadership if he wasn't going to show up for his inauguration as Prime Minister. They would often put that in question. They wouldn't come up with some sarcastic, snarky undertones. Another primary example stems from the somewhat estranged relationship between Churchill and his wife Clementine, who was almost near perfect, played by veteran performer Kristin Scott Thomas. After one of his shouting matches to her, she responds by referring to him in loose terms as an insufferable pig. I mean, I was thinking, whoa, would she actually even say that to him? Yes, I know he seems to have this whole uber toxic masculine approach to him, but I don't think she would actually sink to the depths by calling him an insufferable pig to emasculate him, as I don't think he would have actually even tolerated such a thing. I'm not saying that he would have did anything that he would regret, but I don't think she would have went and said things like that to him no matter what. Yes, maybe in their personal lives they had their share of ups and downs, of some loving, tender moments, and some verbal sparrings here and there. But I just don't think that this whole insufferable pig thing would gel well with this movie. And really, we really I mean, yeah, I know we're kind of like trying to build dimension to this character by exploiting a little bit of things that has happened in his personal life, but I just don't. But I think the whole insufferable pig thing was also felt a little bit forced to put into the script to appease that, to sort of like bring down his alpha male persona just a tad bit. I mean, let's face it, the guy was misogynistic. The guy was a person who let power get into his head, and that's something that you would probably expect when you are a political leader. Yes, you want to build confidence. You want people to root you on. And I guess sometimes it does take a bit of ego to get across. And although Churchill is a stapled named icon in history books, when the subject of World War II comes to mind, he almost has this aura about him that kind of almost makes him off like an immortal comic book hero of some sort. I mean, I guess he would be kind of like in the category of superhero. Of course, as you all know, Hitler's the super villain, with, of course, Stalin and Mussolini being his minions, but still, you know, he seems to become, even through his through his passing in 1954, he's still, considered by many as a person that everybody looks up to, and probably being one of the greatest prime ministers in more recent history. But in the end, he is not just a mighty, powerful leader too. In the end, aside from his power, aside from his fame, you also have to take into consideration that outside the office, he has a home, he has a wife, he has kids, and he's human just like the rest of us. And sometimes, when it comes to running a political office, sometimes you'll make good decisions, and of course, sometimes you'll make bad decisions, and sometimes the decisions you make are not always necessarily the smartest decisions. But still, his moments of weakness and vulnerability never really gets much mention. Here, it gets really, really like shoved in our faces. And yes, in some ways that kind of makes him a much more believable character. But at the same time, even our audience sometimes thinks, even their audience thinks that, is this the right person for the job to run a country, especially at a time like this? In other words, they're just kind of like molding him off as an underdog guy who doesn't seem to know what they're doing, and they're just making him make decisions by hook or by crook. Either he'll succeed or he'll fail. Or that his smart decisions are actually by a fluke or a default. Take, for example, and there are also some historical moments during his time in the office that really never gets as much mentioned, where he's either made good decisions or bad decisions. I mean, they never really quite mention the Gallipoli disaster. Sure, it does come up from time to time, but it's regarded as a minor flaw when it was anything but. He didn't always make the best decisions. I mean, especially in the situations involving the Gallipoli disaster, that was a bad decision on his part. Or even his angst-laden weekly get-together with King George VI which was done with a subtle performance by Ben Mendelsohn, who lays low on the trademark stammer. And I got to admit, yes, Ben Mendelsohn as King George VI, he plays him off very well, even though he's not in a lot of scenes and he's very underused. And he also questions how he manages to hold a high position while consuming to so much alcohol. And his dismissive response, practice. And even though the witty banter is subtle hyperbole, it still has moments where it holds a place in remaining plausible. But however, the script can't seem to get a grip on the scenes and situations where Churchill is at his most vulnerable in the more challenging moments that occurred during the events of World War II, where the Nazis overthrow the smaller countries, the French army losing its battle, 400,000 soldiers were deported to the French island of Dunkirk, where he's stuck in a war cabinet while Chamberlain and Halifax are persuading for him to make surrender with Germany. This is where the realism of the story meanders into a fantasy territory. I mean, yes, they say it's supposed to be inspired by true events with real characters, but sometimes you often wonder, is this historically accurate? I mean, I know people will probably say the excuse like, well, you've had to been there to actually say if all these events really took place. Because there are parts where I just had my doubts. I mean, the most absurd moments was when King George pays a nightly visit while unprotected and unguarded, who out of nowhere and without a reason arbitrarily takes his side to tell him to consult the people and ask for their approval. I mean, what is His Majesty doing outside at night, unguarded and unprotected? You know, most monarchs in countries are going to be marked people, kings and queens. And to just go out unattendedly and to even wake him up at 3 a.m. in the morning just to tell him to consult with the people and become the people's prime minister, I think that is just freaking absurd. At 3 a.m. in the morning. He's asleep. He's a human. And you're telling him these things like as if the guy doesn't have a fucking life of his own. I'm sorry, but those things just does not seem to work out. So after getting off an underground locomotive, once again Prime Minister, what's a Prime Minister doing in an underground locomotive? Doesn't he have fancy cars or limos? I'm sure as a Prime Minister, he's making tons of money. Why is he going down into a locomotive? Oh, I get it. Because he's just trying to be hip. He's trying to be, of the norm. He just wants to be for the people. Well, I'm going to tell you something. Politicians don't work like that. It doesn't matter whether you're a conservative, a Labour Party, or a liberal, or miscellaneous. Most political leaders aren't really for the people. They're out to cater for what they think is right. Oh, but they just want to make him into this hip guy so that he could be a people person like everyone else. Okay, that is commendable. And I'm sure that's going to give him brownie points for the masses. Like, oh, hey, I can take this guy. The guy really is trying to be selfless. But he's not necessarily being selfless. He is being He is just trying to do this to ease his conscience. This is not actually a selfless attempt. This is just his way of making himself more like a comic book hero, like a vigilante. And that's just not how politicians work. They don't really interact too much with other people. They seem to interact with the people who they think is important, not just some average schmo sitting in a locomotive, an underground locomotive. He addresses to the people if he should surrender his fight or let Hitler take over. The crowd response is never. And with that, then he ends up reading a quote from Macaulay's Horatius. All the while, the train ride from St. James Park to Westminster seems to take 10 minutes. Well, I don't know about that. I've never been in a London subway system, so we'll just leave it up to the Britons who watch my channel to know about the station, the way they run things. So that's totally against my call on that. Wright's awkward direction never fully recovers from the surrealism in spite of the acting that is truly the top of the line. So in spite of all the absurdities and the hyperbole that had affected this movie badly, I will have to say that the actors did give it their all. And I think that's one of the reasons why this movie is getting much more higher than I thought. Casting out the supporting cast, Ronald Pickup was truly amazing as the gaunt and ill Chamberlain, who would eventually die 6 months later from cancer. Not Pickup, but Chamberlain himself. Stephen Dillane was also quite impressive as Lord Halifax, who had a vampire-like image towards him. Obviously, they were going to pass off as Chamberlain and Dillane. Chamberlain and Halifax kind of almost like villain characters. I mean, sure, Chamberlain was stepping down as Prime Minister, but that didn't necessarily mean that but that doesn't mean that he was going to go down silently. So they were going to definitely automatically going to make Chamberlain and Halifax as villains. But it's still Gary Oldman. He still delivers a powerful speech at the end of the film with the "We shall fight on the beaches," but it's not very likely that he would be right there on the district line. And yeah, okay, I would have to say, like I said before, it's the performances that really kind of really make up for a lot of the stuff that's depicted in this movie as negative. So in the end, I'm going to say that the directing was kind of mediocre at best. The script just can't seem to decide whether it wants to be a real story or a parody. The performances were top of the line, like I would have expected, even though their situations at times tend to feel a bit surreal. And was I bored out of this movie? Not in any way, shape, or form. And it didn't like fall into full-blown parody. At least we didn't come to like like any stupidity or embarrassing situations. That was done by the characters, but at least they were effective in their respected roles. I just wish that better material would have came from them to make this story seem a little more in historical context than in surrealism, so that the situations they faced seemed somewhat absurd and somewhat inaccurate in its portrayal. So when all said and done, if you're in the mood for some good acting, but with very awkward directing and a very meandering script, then maybe this movie might be for you. But if you're expecting something that's like way uber serious or taken into an historical account, you might be somewhat disappointed. So when all said and done, if I was to give a scale out of 10, I would give Darkest Hour a 6. So I guess this ends my writer review. Thank you all for listening in. If you wish to subscribe to my channel, please feel free to do so. If you wish to leave a comment, go right ahead. But just remember, be kind, be courteous, and don't be rude. And I'll be back again with another movie review. So until next time, this is Eric Wright saying, keep watching those movies, and I'll see you around. Goodbye.